much. Good morning. Thank you for hosting the stage so wonderfully. And yes, as you just said, we talk about many different kinds of divides at Republica, about all kinds of digital divides, data divides, gender divides. But today we want to talk about a different kind of divide, identity. As more than 1 billion people lack the most basic identity papers, and most of those people live in the global south and are women and children. We have two very qualified experts to discuss this topic here with us today, and I'd like to welcome them on stage. Karl Steinacker, the team leader for digital identity with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Welcome, Karl. And Valerie Khan, independent advisor on digital identity. She's an advocate for digital inclusion. Welcome.
Thank you.
I would like to begin by giving you a little bit more background on both our speakers and then a quick introduction to the format before we kick things off. Karl has got a wealth of experience, having spent many years in Africa and the Middle East, but also in the UNHCR headquarters in Geneva. He's built up different refugee camps and closed them as well. He was in charge of refugee registration and the introduction of biometrics at UNHCR from 2004 to 2008. And he leads the UNHCR team on digital identity management based in Copenhagen. And Valerie, as I said, is an independent consultant. She's based in London. She has a focus on digital identity in general, and particularly how we can improve the delivery to the people who need identity in less developed regions. Her approach is based on strengthening local capacities, including getting the right policy frameworks in place, regulations, but also building up skills for people and financial capabilities. Very happy to have them both here, sort of bringing in two different sides, perspectives to the discussion. The format for this session is going to be as such that both Karl and Valerie are going to give a short introductory talk, about 10 to 15 minutes. Karl is going to share a little bit the sort of historical background of the journey that identity management has had over the last years, and Valerie is going to get a bit more technical and sort of showcase the different digital possibilities that we have today. And then after their talks, we're going to sit here on the panel and debate this topic, also with you. Thank you for coming early in the morning to Republica. We look forward also to receiving your questions here on stage. All right, so to kick things off, Karl, would you like to start with your talk?
Okay, thanks very much, Geraldine. Yes, good morning, and thank you for coming that early to hall number 5. I'm going to talk about two journeys. One is the refugee journey, and one is, if you want, the institutional journey of the UNHCR, for which I work since more than 25 years. And then Valerie will, as I said, follow. You know, while I'm talking, you will see in the background some slides we put up, and most of the time you will see people on the move. Because, you know, being a refugee or being a displaced person means that you have to move, not because you want to move, but because you're forced to move. And we know that ourselves, that moving around is very much facilitated by having documents, identity documents, especially if you need to cross borders. And a refugee, by definition, is somebody who crosses a border. There is no refugee, in a legal sense at least, who is residing in his own country. So a refugee, by definition, crosses a border. Internally displaced people obviously stay with them. Now, if you arrive across a border, you ought to have identification, because there is no right, no universal right to cross borders or to be admitted to a country. This is the right countries reserve for themselves to admit you to their territory or not. The only exception to that rule, the only exception is refugee status. The fact that you can arrive at the territory of a state and say, I'm a refugee, I want you to look into my case and then decide whether I can stay here or not. So documentation is extremely important and is therefore not some red tape the UN or whoever has invented, but obviously if people cross a border, they need to be registered, because otherwise the procedure which follows cannot take place. So UNHCR is registering, and that is how we looked at it from our journey, refugees for 60 years now. Refugees cross a border, they are being registered, governments are notified that so-and-so is on their territory, and therefore they have a claim as an asylum seeker or they get refugee status, whatever it is. And then, in many cases, especially in poor countries, those poor countries don't have necessarily the means, to sustain additional population, a population which is destitute, a population which needs to be fed and sheltered and so on. So this registration procedure also very much serves the internal relief administration of this relief industry which has developed over the last decades in the UN, but also the NGO and so on. So people are registered so that they can receive what we call their entitlements. And entitlements in the global south is not very much. It's a tent, it's a plastic sheet to cover your head, it's a sack of rice, a bit of sugar, salt, and oil. And that's how the business has been done for decades, But something is changing. Something is changing, and that is technology is changing. And with technology, and the numbers we are talking about are changing. We have no exact figures, but we reckon there are more than 60 million displaced, forcibly displaced people at the moment on this planet. That's about the size of the population of France. That's not a small number of people, out of which more than 20 million are refugees. And these populations are living on the expense of other governments, of the governments of the North, the governments who contribute through their taxpayers' money to their upkeep. And they want value for money. Those governments want value for money, and those governments put agencies like ours under a lot of scrutiny, to spend their money in a way which they can defend, vis-à-vis their voters or their parliaments or their audit courts or whatever. So these two together, the increase of beneficiaries, and I know there's a lot of discussion in Germany, in Europe, and about refugees here, but that's a drop in the ocean. 90% of the people we are talking about are not in Europe. More than 90% are in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's where the problem is. Here, this is being dealt with. And it is being dealt with by the governments here, because the governments in the north are sufficiently wealthy to do this. But it's the south where governments have basically delegated the upkeep and of this population to international organizations. And the advent of new technologies basically puts a lot of pressure on us, on those who deliver aid, to modernize our systems. So the first, so what was a pen and paper exercise in the 1950s and 60s was then kind of automated in the 80s and 90s, at a time when the countries in which we were operating were far of having such technologies. And those countries basically, as I said, kind of delegated that task to the international community. And we introduced then new features like biometrics. Biometrics is under a lot of discussion, but was very much welcomed by those people who do offer and work in the relief sector, because it was considered to be a much more dignified way of identifying people than the way it was done before. The way it was done before, in mass situations where you have to, really use completely different systems of amassing people, crowd control, and so on, was not very dignified. So biometrics was introduced as a early, and there are different types of biometrics anyway. Now we are at a situation where UNHCR, my organization, has more than 8 million data sets, or data sets about 8 million refugees in our databases. the World Food Programme, which does not only feed refugees but many more populations, has even more, I think 20 million or more than 20 million. And you know, as data is the new money, a lot of people are now interested in our data. And we didn't realize that. We were, you know, we are a bureaucracy, very conservative bunch of people. So we have all these data in our databases, and we realize, oh, there is interest from the private sector. They, you know, they would like to see our data. They would say, they come and say, well, you know what? You have all these people. And it's true, these people, you know, they are poor and they can't have bank accounts. They can't do online banking. And so can't we, you know, can't we do something? Can we not put money transfers in whatever? And, you know, and we were listening to that and we said, very interesting, because, you know, one of the basic problems is that in this closed loop system where refugees are in our databases, they are still have excluded from many services. They are excluded from very basic things like freedom of movement, often, depending on the country. They are excluded from buying a SIM card. You know, it's only in a few countries where refugees can legally buy a SIM card. Labor market, you name it. There are a lot of measures in various countries taken, you know, to exclude and to keep refugees out of the normal socioeconomic system. And then, you know, we started, you know, coming from this, out from these external pressures which were put on us by governments and by industries, by business, and to say, hey, maybe it's time that we as an institution review our own way of doing business and review this, what we call registration, and see, maybe there's much more to it than, you know, just having a closed loop system where we collect data for ourselves and for our own purposes. And at that time, the Sustainable Development Goals were also worked on, and one, you might know that Goal 16.9, or Target 9 of Goal 16, whatever it is, says identity for all by 2030. So the countries, and the UN is an organization of countries, you know, it's not an NGO, has committed by 2030 that everyone should have an identity. And the reality, of course, is that whatever we give refugees is not an identity. No one has ever asked the UN to provide identities. And we have populations which come without anything. You know, not only because in many countries identity papers or identity is not normally established, but because of the situation. You know, when Boko Haram, to give you an example, started their insurgency in northeastern Nigeria, the first thing they did is they burned down all government offices, including the civil registration offices. So you have millions of people who move around and have nothing. Have nothing and cannot refer back to anything and say, well, you know, I might not have a document, but over there is the civil registry department, I can get a new. No, there is nothing. The reality for millions of people on this planet is there's nothing. And according to the World Bank figures, they reckon that 1 billion people have no identity documents. Now, no identity documents, I don't need to tell you what that means. You know, in your normal life, you know that whenever you have to produce identity documents, and that you need identity documents to get other documents. I mentioned SIM cards, I mentioned maybe credit cards, bank accounts, and so on. So therefore, we collectively in the UN, but also with other institutions, are now thinking, how can we use this data, which is there? You know, the personal data, the claimed identities of people, because very often they have no documents. How can we use them and make them useful for people so that they can be included, that they can, you know, that they, very basic things which we take for granted they can do, that they can move around freely, that they can have access to services, and so on. And that is digital identity. And the digital space is added to the physical space. So when we talk about freedom of movement, there's the movement that you know, you move in a territory, but maybe you also move in the digital space. So this is what is going on, and we hopefully, in a few years, are able also to propose states different systems, because the bottom line is that we can give people all kinds of documents or gadgets, you know. We can give identities and of QR codes and of screens and smart cards and whatnot. If those identities are not recognized, they are not very useful. In fact, they are useless. And therefore, it's technology plus the regulatory framework which is required, on which we are working, and hopefully in a few years we can come back here and give you good news on identity for forcibly displaced people. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Karl. Thank you very much, Karl. Very interesting. Valerie's up next with her input, and please make notes of your questions and comments. I've definitely got a few after that. Yeah, very insightful input.
Yes, so thank you, Geraldine, and good morning, everybody. Very excited to be here. So I would like to pick up to the points that Karl was just introducing. And I think, I mean, importantly, I hope you overheard that Karl was introducing the concept of identity as a right that gives, like as a right before the law, that basically enables people to access goods and services. So on the basis, as you heard as well, there are 1.1 billion people in the world that don't have this access to these services. So that's a problem. But I would like to actually build on that and extend on that and say, just like this little girl is pointing out, we're humans at the end of the day, and being human means hopefully more than being a refugee at that point in time with access or with needs to access to services and goods. And what I'm referring to is the ability to actually start using this further. So what is it that this little girl would need in order to trust that she actually eventually gets access to education, that with this, she actually has the ability to build a career, which enables her to earn money, which enables her to open a bank account, and so on and so forth. So hopefully she will be buying a flight, like an airline ticket, and actually cross borders herself one day. And at the same time, you obviously want a system that can trust in her collecting this type of information so that she does get access to all of this. I mean, banks eventually also need to trust into a system. So on that basis, I also will just pick up a few points around technology and digital and so on, because at the end of the day, we do have identities already today in some parts. Certain people might lose them, but then again, identity systems today also suffer from a great problem around fragmentation. We don't capture all the necessary information, or we might capture it wrongly. The systems are complicated, and very often the systems are being abused as well. So what are our options today? What is the environment we're working in? And like Karl was saying as well, technology has certainly arrived. It has arrived here, but it has also arrived in all the regions that we're working in. Today, 7 out of 10 people have access to a mobile phone. And that's, I'm talking about the poor households. Also, the estimation is that in about 2020, 50% of these people will have access to a smartphone. And remember, this is all more than they have today access to sanitation, clean water, or energy. And over the time distance, that is a massive growth. So what does that mean? I mean, what does that enable us to do? And I said smartphones, so obviously they start having access to internet as well. Well, by all its excitement, that obviously also bears certain risks and certain things that we probably want to be aware of just to understand who is in the game. And if you think today, within, like across Africa, 7 out of 10 people use Facebook as the entrance to the internet. For them, Facebook is the internet. And I think it's important to be aware of that as well. They know how to use and how to handle, navigate around these digital technologies, but there are certain entrances that we might not have had when we started using the internet. So again, what does that mean to us? I mean, what does that mean to organizations? And we talk much about as well, what does that mean to governments? What does that enable them possibly to do? And I think generally we can be excited about this. I mean, there is much great coming from this. This enables a lot of new open doors that we can use. But it's important to notice as well, of course, that what excites someone, and I mean, we'll surely talk about all different technologies as well, we got to be aware that there are always two sides to this. So what excites someone might look very different to someone else. So it's important to consider perceptions. So let's break this all down, because exactly to understand all these perceptions, you need to understand the situation on the ground, and you need to understand what you're actually trying to achieve. And for that, it is important to understand the process steps that you're actually trying to tackle, because overall, it's not that complicated, really. So first of all, think about an identity system to be able to include people. Inclusion is the most important first process step. You want to make sure that you can go into regions that are hard to reach, and you can reach people that are hard to reach as well. They might be disabled, they might be illiterate, and so on and so forth. And when you reach inclusion, you actually overcome the problem of fragmentation. So let me give you an example. 20 years, Peru was suffering from horrible violence between government and rebel groups. That led to about 70,000 people dead, it led to about 600,000 people displaced, and it led to many more people being without any document. Now, in this chaotic process, people started to get back onto the system, and many people used this as an opportunity as well to register themselves twice. Other people had no opportunity to be registered. And then, of course, you have all these rebel groups that might want to disappear as well. So they also find a new way of being a new person. And ultimately, of course, that means that eventually an electoral process comes up and people don't trust it anymore. And that means that people don't trust the democracy they live in. So Peru put a great effort into all of this and actually managed to almost reach 100% coverage. And they did this in such a way that was so inclusive to everybody that people today trust the Peruvian identity system more than they actually trust in the Catholic Church. That's something, I'd say. So inclusion. But what do? You've got everybody on the system. You want to make sure that when they come back, you can actually verify them. A missing verification often leads to fragmentation as well, but it also leads to abuse of the system, and it also leads to people basically trying to double dip, as we call it. They basically want to take things twice or three times out of the system. So again, I'll give you an example here. Nigeria. Nigeria set up a process to verify its workers, its civil workers. So what they did is they let everybody who wanted to receive their salary come back and verify themselves. Now, that process showed them that there were 65,000 people that actually went on the payroll. And that was a saving within 1 year of $1 billion US. And just to put that in perspective as well, that was a return of investment of 20,000%. So definitely worth putting the money into the hand. So you've identified them, you've verified them, but how do you make sure that they actually receive what they are eligible to receive? If you run a program that targets pregnant women, you don't want to just make sure it's a woman in front of you, you want to in fact make sure it's a pregnant woman. If you run a program for children to encourage them to go to school, you want to in fact make sure that the benefit goes to the children that attended the class. And I mean, you can look at your own life as well. If you go to the bank, that's not enough. If you just verify who you are, that's not enough. You need to show further information. We live with this across the board everywhere. So like I said, you want to make sure you get identification, verification, and assertion right. Now, what does that, however, mean as well? Imagine you do this. Then you basically create a string of information that is attached to you that just tells you who you are and everything you do with this repeatedly. And you can probably imagine how incredibly valuable that is for some people. So just to give you a few numbers here as well, last year alone we had 2.5 billion cases that were hacked. That led to $60 billion US lost in the system. And that's an increase from the year before of 88%. Now that's here to stay. That's not going to go away. You have to deal with it. So the important thing is, don't try to find a way to keep your data secure, because it's not secure. It will never be secure. Hackers are ahead of you. But what you can make sure is you can make the information less valuable. Stop attaching everything together. Stop making a string. Don't create that incentive. Detach the information from one another. Because if you know about me that I am Valerie Khan and I have a certain health record and I have a certain place where I live and I do these things and I have these friends, that's valuable. If you know that I'm Valerie Khan and I'm standing here today, well, that's not valuable because you know that anyway. So make sure that your data privacy and protection rules are in place and that you safeguard the data accurately by not even creating an incentive. And how is that possible? Well, it's actually, again, it's fairly easy. Just work with what you've got already. Your current system offers a lot of opportunities and possibilities. And what I mean with that is you've got to create a governance that works for everybody, that includes everybody, because at the end of the day, you might think that there is an odd one, but don't believe it because it might just be the one that makes the show. So include everybody, and do that by creating an architecture that works for everybody. So, like I said at the beginning, there are certain elements that you want to think about, but again, it's not actually that complicated if you start really taking a process step. So let me just repeat again to you. What is it? You want to make sure that you have inclusion, verification, and assertion in place. You also set up a robust trust governance that invites everybody to participate. You have an easy and integrated architecture that makes it easy for everybody to collaborate. And you respect data privacy and data protection to avoid any theft or mishandling of your data. And if you do that, you actually are going to achieve the most efficient, effective and economic system because you overcome all the problems of exclusion, of fragmentation, and you basically make sure that you do not leave anyone behind. And if you follow that path, then I would argue you are creating a future for this little girl, just like the little girl at the beginning as well, because now she can trust in a system that offers her all these opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karl and Valerie, for those really interesting inputs. We have about just under 30 minutes left to discuss. If you'd like to join in with a question or a comment, I'm going to open the floor in about 10 minutes. It would be wonderful if you can come to the middle of the floor here, and we will meet you there with a microphone in between our two rows of chairs. Thanks. You touched upon a lot of very interesting topics that I hope we can all address on the panel now. So I'd like to talk about some of the points that you raised, including the technological sides that you spoke about, and maybe think that a little bit further. But before we go there, I'd like to take it back a step and really talk about identity ownership. And I think you made a very good point about explaining why identity is important for many people in many different positions, whether you're a refugee or a seeker of your social services in your state. I want to start really, really basic. I don't own my passport. My government owns it, correct? That's the case, I'm assuming, not just in Germany, but in all countries around the world. Do you think it's important that we rethink the sort of idea of identity management, looking at the individual of the owner of the identity rather than the state or a third-party force?
Well, I think identity, in fact, is a deal, right? The state establishes your identity and therefore basically trusts you that you are the person you are. And you, being the individual, you trust that the government or the authorities representing that state handle that identity data respectfully and appropriately. And the problem we have in many places is that that trust relationship does not exist.
Right.
Right? So the state does not trust the people which they meet in the street, so to speak, and in particular, people do not trust that their data is secure, safe, and properly dealt with. And therefore, trust is the key concept of identity. Without trust systems, there can't be an identity on, let's say, a mutual basis. So the question is, therefore, how do we get there? We know what we want to. Are there intermediate steps? Are there and yes, we believe that there could be some intermediate steps where we could create complementary identity systems. Let's say the best example is always given around birth certificates. You know, in most sub-Saharan Africas, the majority of children has no birth certificates. However, most of them are vaccinated, and there are vaccination booklets. And the question is, could, for instance, in which way, these booklets could substitute or complement birth certificates? These kind of discussions are going on, so that we eventually reach full coverage of identity for children. Can we provide user-centric identities? Can we give something to people which is basically certified? There must be some certification to it, and then they can show it around. These discussions are ongoing, but they need to be negotiated, and most likely they need to be negotiated country by country. It's very unlikely that we will have a universal regime on these kind of things. Now, one last word. I do not believe in crypto identity. Valerie mentioned that the big tech companies have a huge market share, and obviously they can identify people. They can do it maybe even better than some states can do. But I cannot see the added value if we kind of outsource identity management or the establishment and certification of identities to the tech sector.
I want to get there in just 1 minute, so thanks for already dropping the big buzzword that we obviously want to talk about. I want to also pass this question to you. I thought an interesting point that you made is, make your data less valuable. And I think that's a very important thing to say in many data contexts that we're active in. However, especially in this field where, in fact, you're not responsible for your own data string. If we follow this idea that you're sort of in charge of maintaining your identity, perhaps, but you don't issue yourself your identity and you're not sort of the owner of it, aren't there many governments, many players that have an interest in creating this long data string?
Yeah, no, actually it's interesting that we always think it's the governments that have that interest. I would argue that currently, especially where we live, it's ourselves who do that most at the moment. We open up a Facebook account and we give all information freely. And that is a long string of information that I think we should have learned from now the recent events, how that gets abused. And that's us. That's us freely doing that. The government is actually, in fact, not so much setting up a string, because if you look at it, the passport is true, the passport is created by the government. The government gives you your nationality, but you don't use your passport for everything. And people don't type in your passport number as the reference for something, even where you have to verify yourself with the passport. So your passport information is, the string on your passport information is actually a lot shorter than the strings we start creating for ourselves.
Right. If I understood you correctly, and I hope, luckily we're not quite there yet, where Facebook requires you to enter your passport number as a user verification.
It does in America.
It does in America?
It does in America now, yeah.
Okay, and I mean, you didn't raise the Equifax example, but of course, when you started speaking about identity theft and hacking in sensitive contexts, that's the best example for last year, where basically nearly 2/3 of America has their social security number stolen.
Yep.
But you made it sound also like not necessarily a believer in cryptography and protecting data that way. And because of this idea that, hackers are always a step ahead of you?
Well, yeah, but I don't think that necessarily is connected with one another. Hackers will always be ahead of you, regardless which technology you use. I mean, today already, it's fairly easy to actually find out my real identity of my Bitcoin wallet. And that's already crypto like cryptographically secured. But if you just follow people's patterns, if you don't set up a wallet every time, if you follow people's pattern, you can identify the person at the end. And it's been shown already scientifically. So it's not necessarily the technology that serves you from that hacking. It's like I said, it's really try to find a way to separate the information from each other, so you never have a string. You never have the information attached.
How closely do you think these discourses are related to one another, though, or do you see these as being like very far apart in the same? In a spectrum of discourses around identity, because the one discussion that we have here a lot is about, making sure you know what information you put out there, managing your own digital identity, being aware of it, and being aware of the consequences you might have, which is a discussion that we leave in a lot of the time very safe and wealthy contexts here, rather than discussion of sort of the bare necessity of being able to own and maintain an identity.
I think, you see, there is an obvious link, and it has to do with the fact that a refugee is somebody who has lost trust in the country where he comes from. He's gone somewhere else for whatever reason, and he has good reason to conceal a lot of his information, and therefore wherever he arrives, that refugee, you need first of all to create some kind of trust relationship that he offers information, because after a traumatizing departure and having maybe left a police state where there was a lot of surveillance, so that's not obvious. So you have to guarantee privacy and data security somehow. Otherwise. You're going to end up with phantom and ghost identities and so on, which doesn't help, because first of all it is likely to fall back on the individual, but it also leads to special treatments of refugees in the way states deal with them. A lot of the data protection which is normal for citizens is simply not applied to refugees, especially also here in the north.
I want to touch on two things that you mentioned in your talk. The one was where, I was like, the private sector interest in the data that you have today. Obviously, you're dealing with people in the most sensitive of situations and very valuable yet very, very personal data. How do you deal with those data requests? What is the general attitude toward?
We reject them. But you see, it was an interesting experience for us to see, why would give you an example. We have a database with 2 million anonymous iris scans from Afghan refugees who repatriated from Pakistan to Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, there was a lot of interest. People wanted to have access to this anonymous, they are anonymous. We don't know whose iris scans these are, but there is interest. And then there's, and then some people say we have a scientific interest, and other people have, there is, so far, we do not share data with the private sector, but there is a very clear interest to that. So maybe more, and also we see our data is not actually organized right now that we could, share just parts of it or this or that. So it triggered, a kind of review and rethinking of what we have and how we use it and what we use it for. And we have come now to the conclusion that the best way of using data is in the benefit of the individual. But that means also that we have to rework a lot of business processes we have internally. Right now, refugees can't access their own data. They can't query their data and things like that.
So we're right in the middle of the topic of data management. Isn't that where the blockchain offers an incredible opportunity to rethink the whole idea about data ownership and data management?
Well, I think blockchain holds a lot of promises for the future. And as a matter of fact, I am a guest lecturer at UCL for blockchain for identity, so I can't deny that I do see a potential there. But I think we've got to be careful, and this is what I was trying to bring across as well. There are certain elements that we need to obey to. There's certain rules and principles that we need to stick to. And blockchain, just like any other technology, and actually, I mean, I would actually really try to more lean towards distributed ledger technology. Just like any other technology, has to obey these rules and has to fit into the situation we have, including offline and online and all of these circumstances that we're dealing with. So I'm not there yet to say that I think the solution is living up to the promises it gives at the moment, but it certainly is a technology that is worth looking into and investigating further. So I wouldn't exclude it. I would just say let's look at it just like we look at everything else in order to fill the gaps and fill the requirements that we need.
Karl, you were skeptical. Why is that?
I hoped you wouldn't pose that question. I have blockchain vendors passing by my office by the week. And it has become my habit to put the question back and say, can you tell me what my problem is? And when you have explained to me what my problem is, then explain to me how blockchain is going to solve it. We are going to do a blockchain pilot soon. Frankly, I'm not a techie at all. You know, I've managed refugee camps. That's where I come from. I have no pros and no cons. I just think that you know the blockchain has to show its value in practice. You know, if I need a you know, most refugees. You know, I mean, we just the global south, how it works. You know. Refugee camps have no electricity to start with, you know. I understand that you need a power plant to run, you know, your blockchain mining. You know, there are certain questions. Or, you know, it was said, people in Africa have telephones. Yes, they have telephones, but they are shared. 5 people share a telephone, you know. So I'm not 100% sure how this would work. If it works, I'm all for it.
I just want to remind you guys that your questions are very welcome, and if you want to ask one, it would be wonderful if you can just come up in the middle of these 2 aisles. Okay, somebody's jumping right up. Do we have a microphone for you, please? The microphone is on its way to you. I'm going to ask a quick question while it's coming to you. So on the complete other end of the spectrum of believers, organizations like, without wanting to advertise for them, BitNation and other organizations like that who believe that in a maybe not too far away future we'll all be the individual managers of identity. We can sort of choose our peer group to belong to, free of having a nationality, and this sort of completely other idea of how identity and identity management can work. Do you think that's crazy talk?
Well, I think it comes down to governance. And that's the thing. I mean, like, I think Karl is definitely right. It's like the companies are coming by the day saying, well, we've got a solution for this. And yet they haven't been there. They haven't seen the situation. They don't know exactly what they're talking about. They might not understand.
So it's kind of like hipster startups from rich European cities coming saying, I'm going to fix all your refugee problems.
Unfortunately, there is a lot of that, yes. And I don't want to discourage the motivation that they put to the table. I mean, that's very good to see. But at the same time, we need to think about the situation we have on the ground. And we have, I mean, the point is we have a situation on the ground. We have banks there. We have existing infrastructure. We have like businesses working there. And we need to incorporate them. So if someone like BitNation can come along and actually work it out with all of them, then I would say, great, that seems to be the right way forward. But I would argue that we are probably in a very good position to intermediate that discussion, and that discussion isn't as easy as just a technology that says, look, we can do this for you.
Right. Let's take these 2 questions. You first, and then you.
Thank you. I'm Holger from GIZ. I have 2 questions. First one, do you share the data with the countries of origins of the refugees? Are there requests? And the second is, you mentioned that the data identity management is like a mix of technology and regulatory frameworks. Could you elaborate a bit more on the questions that arise on the regulatory frameworks?
Both addressed to Karl, or the first to Karl, the second? Okay.
In principle, we do not share any data with countries of origin. that can change at the moment of repatriation. So if there is an agreement, an international agreement, a signed treaty between the country of origin and the country of asylum, that there is an organized and voluntary return, there might be some data shared. Obviously, you know, the data, who's going back, you know, when convoys organized or this kind of thing. There will never be any what we call protection-sensitive data is shared. That is not happening. With regard to technology and the regulatory framework, yes, indeed. You know, we can, and we issue since years documents. Maybe lately we are using plastic and smart cards and so on. But as I said, they have very different value depending on the environment where they are used. You can, and that depends basically on those governments who run the territory. They can be extremely generous, where basically a UNHCR issued card is as good as a national ID card. Malaysia is an example for that, let's say. And there are other places where we can issue basically a card which doesn't even allow you to leave the camp, because there is no freedom of movement for refugees in that particular country. And there are many of those, many more of those than the others. So if you were to, you know, so we need to manage identity in a way which is aligned to the situation, and thereby also trying to change the situation. You know, and hopefully, and that's one of the hopes we have, is that we can, through introduction of digital technology, convince states that they can be less restrictive with refugees. Because one of the changes in recent years is obviously that technology has become much cheaper, much more widespread, and countries which did not before use digital technology for population management, now they do, and therefore we have to see interoperabilities and compatibilities and so on. But in the end, it's what states allow. And that might be a question to answer to your question. Is our experience is that in most cases it's what the state decides what matters and not what others think they decide.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, this was a great conversation. My name is Mickey McManus, author of Trillions. And I'm curious, I haven't heard a lot of anyone talking about using actual scientists to validate or determine what's happening in a lot of these new technologies. You have data scientists, but those aren't really scientists. You have economists, those are barely scientists. You have this sort of lack of rigor of evaluation. You have technologists advising places like the UN instead of scientists. So I'm really curious about, you know, in science you have a lot of opportunities to look at biomimicry, for example, but for information systems. Nature's been running a complex information system for 3 billion years. Not so bad. But I don't hear, and nature has nothing that's entirely peer-to-peer, and nothing that's entirely a single point of failure or centralized, because nature abhors singletons. So I'm just curious, I don't hear much rigor around how we study nature and biomimicry for information systems to actually look at how they've already solved it. So we have camouflage in nature because there are always bad people or bad organisms. In World War II, we had scientists who built things like Bletchley Park, and on the other side, bad people who had science as well. I haven't heard anything about pocket Bletchley Parks to go hide us back into the noise. I haven't heard anything about kind of how we do biomimicry. So I'm just curious what's happening in the standpoint of actually using and studying complex information systems that have been out there for a few billion years.
Can I just sort of summarize, because this is also going to be the closing question for the panel, maybe not summarize, but just add, I think what you said is a very interesting outlook. It sort of ties in also with the discussion, how far can you allow to be innovative and innovate as organizations such as yours, when you need to, like you said, create trust and reliability, but on the other hand, there's also a necessity to innovate, and perhaps also a little bit of a future outlook, as a closing statement from both of you.
Well, I said earlier that these discussions were brought to us externally. You know, it's what governments want from us and what the private sector wants from us, which in a way triggered this review and this innovative thinking. And I suppose it will remain like that, because we are an organization who operates on a shoestring, and which prouds itself that most of its funding goes to poor people, rather than, you know, to be thought leaders of this or the other. And so, yes, it's basically about establishing a conversation with those who are researchers. It's not about us doing that research. You will be waiting a long time to hear from us this kind of thoughts and innovations and so on. I don't think that's our core competence. Our core competence is to protect refugees, and we will use technology as appropriate and as innovative as we can, and we will always try to negotiate the best deal with the governments who host those refugees.
I'm maybe in a little bit in a better position, so to say, because I can afford having all these conversations, and I see as well that they get very much encouraged. We work with a lot of academics. We do actually try to be as scientific as it gets. We've spent a lot of time in researching existing identity systems to the extent, and you can check on this later if you want, that I would say we've very much looked into every identity system that is existing currently around the globe. And what I showed you before, this whole process of identification, verification, and assertion, comes out of that research. It sounds simple, but it's actually a reflection of what we have seen over and over and over again. And we have seen it over and over again, missing one of them, or being wrong in one of them, or just doing it somehow differently. And we can say that if you do that, you don't do it right. So we're looking for the golden egg, if you want, to say who's doing it well, who's doing all of this well. And that's a question that is more interesting, of course. Take all the learning, but is there actually anyone out there? Is there technology out there? And again, I include all technologies in this that can eventually achieve this. And I think as well, to Karl's point, the fact that we sit here together shows that there is a communication also with the UN agencies, because it's true the UN agencies have a mandate that they need to pursue and not waste any money on the side. But people like us, we don't have that. So we're here to basically bring that knowledge in and encourage the conversation outside.
I thank you very much for also encouraging the conversation inside Republica. It was a very, very interesting session. I'd like to invite you both back to continue this discussion, because I feel like we could have definitely gone on and maybe also included perhaps even some of the people affected by these situations, or some of the people technologically developing some of these more avant-garde solutions. So it'd be wonderful to continue this discussion with you both next year at Republica. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.